Hi, I'm Tamara Kandakar. On Monday, Balraj Nijjar, son of prominent Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar, spoke publicly for the first time about the murder of his father. He was speaking in the parking lot of the Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara in Surrey, BC, where his dad was gunned down just 3 months ago. Behind him, members of the temple gathered for a memorial.
It was just a matter of time for when the truth would come out. So when we heard that news today, it was a sense of relief that, it's finally coming to the public eyes that, the Indian government is involved in this. It's not like a dispute within the community, but it's a really serious foreign interference case.
The news Balraj is referring to is, of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's bombshell accusation that Canada has credible intelligence linking agents of the Indian government to his father's killing.
Canada is a rule of law country. The protection of our citizens and defense of our sovereignty are fundamental. Our top priorities have therefore been, one, that our law enforcement and security agencies ensure the continued safety of all Canadians, and two, that all steps be taken to hold perpetrators of this murder to account.
Balraj says he's grateful for the attention that Trudeau's government and opposition parties are giving to his father's case.
Hopefully you can take this a step further and get specific individuals, maybe place sanctions, whatever the next steps are. We're waiting as a family to see what it is. This is just step one in the family's eyes and the community that, we now...
There are still a lot of unanswered questions about the evidence that led Trudeau to make these allegations, which Indian government officials are calling absurd and unsubstantiated. Today, who was Hardeep Singh Nijjar? Why did someone, maybe the Indian state, want him dead? And why did so many in the Sikh community suspect Indian government involvement all along? I'm joined by Jaskaran Sandhu. He's a co-founder of Baz News, an online outlet for the Sikh and Punjabi diaspora, and a board member of the World Sikh Organization. Hi, Jaskaran. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So if you're learning about this murder and about Hardeep Singh Nijjar for the first time, you might be getting some pretty conflicting descriptions. So many in the Sikh community say that he was a leader and an activist, while the Indian government says he was a terrorist. So who was Hardeep Singh Nijjar and what did he believe in?
Mr. Nijjar was a president of a prominent Gurdwara in Surrey. And a Gurdwara is a place of worship for the Sikhs. And he was also someone that was very active in activist circles. He spoke often on human rights issues, grievances with the Indian state from the Sikh community, and also on Khalistan, which is the Sikh self-determination or sovereignty movement. And so he was very well known amongst Sikh circles. And he was also someone that was recently part of organizing the Khalistan referendum. And the Khalistan referendum is a non-binding vote that's been happening across the world in the Sikh diaspora, including Australia, the UK, Canada, United States, just as an example. And this non-binding vote is set up to examine the level of interest within the Sikh community on the issue and concept of Khalistan.
Right. And what does the Indian government accuse him of? Why do they say that he was a terrorist?
And so the Indian government accused him of organizing hits in India, of leading or being the front man of a Khalistan organization, of organizing training camps in British Columbia. No evidence has ever been given. And so the Indian government has thrown a lot of different labels at Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And a lot of these labels are also thrown at others that also advocate or organize around similar issues from the Sikh community.
Right. Okay. So based on what you said, his activism was peaceful. He was part of organizing this referendum. Did he ever advocate for any kind of violence for the Khalistani cause?
No, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was committed to the concept around this referendum. I think he truly believed that the ballot box is where the cause of Khalistan can be won. And he was very passionate about that cause. As far as violence goes, there was never anything to pin him to any sort of violence that the Indian government was claiming. And that's what makes kind of all this really absurd and tragic.
Yeah, and I want to get into why you think this is absurd, but it's now been 3 months since he was gunned down outside this Gurdwara in Surrey. It happened right after evening prayers, and the investigation is ongoing. But at this point, what do we know about his murder?
He was gunned outside of the Gurdwara while sitting in his car. And he died tragically.
Nijjar was gunned down outside his Gurdwara in June. Violence CSIS had reportedly warned him about. In the 3 months since his killing, Sikh separatists say the RCMP has been in touch.
Hardeep Singh was, pretty open about it. He went on Punjabi radio, for example, to talk about the threats on his life. He spoke about it within the community, and everyone knew that he was facing deep threats. And I think what frustrated the Sikh community, especially in June after he was murdered, was, where was Canada? Like, where was our security agencies? How could they allow this to happen, especially when they knew it was coming?
Right. Yeah, I know his son has said that leading up to his death, he had been meeting with CSIS agents pretty much on a weekly basis. So at this point, you haven't heard anything about whether or not he was getting protection, right? Or there's no evidence that he was getting any kind of protection from Canada.
No, nothing that we can say with confidence. It's kind of, it does really feel like they kind of left him to dry, and the amount of security or surveillance that should have been provided to him, wasn't.
Why did Nijjar not have police protection? Minister of Public Safety Dominic LeBlanc said that is not federal jurisdiction.
The individual decisions by law enforcement agencies around who receives police protection are made by police officials, not by ministers.
But was the information passed to police?
Now, that didn't change the way Hardeep Singh Nijjar behaved, though, and I don't want to make that very clear. He was still very active. He was still speaking unapologetically about Sikh causes. He was still attending protests. He was still organizing the Khalistan referendum in Surrey. So the manner in which he operated didn't change. And so that is seen as a heroic thing. He is seen in the Sikh community as a shaheed, which means a martyr, which is a title that's held in very high esteem in the Sikh faith. So, but as far as protection goes from the state, a lot of Sikhs do feel that Canada failed at providing Hardeep Singh Nijjar everything it could.
So he was killed mid-June. There was suspicion in the community at the time that the Indian government was behind it.
A lot of people believe that Mr. Nijjar was specifically targeted and he was deliberately targeted inside the Gurdwara. I also believe so.
It was obviously a big shock, but right away we knew who the suspects were. Obviously the outside community that aren't as involved in the Khalistan movement or coming to the Gurdwara and meeting my dad in person would not potentially have that knowledge. But for that person who did know him, they knew it was the Indian government. It was just a matter of time for when the truth would come out.
He had obviously gone public to talk about these threats. I know there were protests at Indian consulates around the world, but we hadn't heard much about it since then. But fast forward to earlier this month, we start to see some signs of tension between Canada and India. So Canada calls for a pause in trade talks. India hosts the G20, where there's clearly some tension between Trudeau and Modi.
Modi today pushed Trudeau to rein in Sikh separatists in Canada, and Trudeau says he pushed back on Indian interference in Canada.
Then Canada postpones an October trade mission to India, and 3 days later, Trudeau announces these allegations about Nijjar's murder in the House of Commons, which he apparently confronted Modi about at the G20, which may explain some of that tension. What exactly is India being accused of here?
Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty.
Canada is investigating further, and my understanding, there's quite a bit in the pipeline that's going to be coming out here, and so that's what's being leveled against the Indian government, and that's something the community believes is absolutely true, and would have believed it even if it wasn't put on the official record. I think what's impressed the Sikh community quite a bit in the last 48 hours is how strong the government has been on it and how unwavering they've been on it since making the announcement, considering the pushback from India.
Right. Yeah. But I guess to be clear, the allegations are coming from what the government is saying is credible intelligence, but they haven't said publicly what the intelligence is, right? Have the RCMP, who are the ones leading the investigation into the killing, or CSIS detailed what any of the evidence is here?
No, we haven't seen anything like that yet.
The Indian government totally denies all responsibility. What have they said in response to these allegations?
They're denying it outright, and what they're claiming is happening is Trudeau playing what they call vote bank politics, and that's a term India uses often when talking about Trudeau and the Canadian government's persistence in arguing that Sikhs practicing charter rights is not illegal, is not terrorism. The Indian government is also saying that there is no evidence, there's no proof, there's nothing to respond to, and that's the position they've had over the last day or two. And we've also seen other kind of tit for tat measures taken by India. They expelled a diplomat for anti-India activities in response to Canada expelling a high-ranking diplomat from the High Commission in Ottawa for being involved with RAW, which is India's Central Intelligence Agency. And India also released a travel advisory telling Indian nationals and Indian international students, which is a huge cohort of the student body in Canadian schools, that there's a travel advisory within Canada because of anti-India activities.
So India has accused Canada for a long time of harboring terrorists. For people who don't know anything about this, can you just explain sort of what they're talking about exactly?
Yeah, if you look at the Sikh community in Canada, it's close to 1 million. It's one of the largest minority groups in Canada. It makes up over 2% of Canada's population, which in relation to India as a proportion is actually higher in Canada, which I think will surprise a lot of folks. And the Sikh diaspora is the Sikh diaspora in Canada is larger than it is anywhere else in the world. And so the Sikh community here, it's pretty fearless in its advocacy on various issues which India does not like. And that includes advocacy on human rights issues. That includes advocacy against the BJP Hindu nationalist government. There's a movement called Hindutva, which is Hindu nationalism, and which comes at the cost of India's various minority communities, but primarily Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs, as well as the Dalit community. Sikhs are very loud in expressing their grievances with the Indian state, especially stemming from the 1984 Sikh genocide, which where justice is still outstanding, 30 plus years. But probably most prolific is India's issue with the advocacy for Khalistan out of the Sikh Canadian community. India treats any advocacy about Khalistan, even peaceful, as an act of terror or extremism, which is, again, in the Sikh community's eyes, absurd. Any democratic country would allow for free expression, and international law protects the rights to self-determination. But India has always raised these concerns with Canadian officials during bilateral meetings, and Canada has been pretty consistent, irrespective of the government in power, whether it was Harper's Conservatives or Trudeau's Liberals, and that we can't just arbitrarily or extrajudicially crack down on Sikhs. Now, that is the norm in India. That is how India treats, especially minority communities. But that is not the way Canada treats treats political free speech.
So since Trudeau made these allegations, Canada has expelled an Indian diplomat. You mentioned India expelled a top Canadian diplomat. They've shelved a trade mission. So things are really ramping up. And Trudeau has said that he's not looking to provoke or escalate tensions with India. But the fact is, saying there is credible evidence that India committed an extrajudicial, extraterritorial killing of a Canadian citizen, that's really big. So what have we heard from Canada's allies?
So we've had statements from the UK and Australia as well, expressing concern with the allegations and calling on India to cooperate with any investigation. I think you've seen some caution from our partners, in particular in the UK and Australia, in that this is an ongoing investigation, and they can't speak to it to any great extent, especially because the intelligence involved is still confidential. The loudest response has been from the Americans, who have just today released further statements to make it in very clear and unequivocal terms that they are cooperating with Canada on this and they are taking it seriously. And so we've seen from our allies in America, some recognition over the last few years of the problems with India. For example, the State Department in America, which releases a report on human rights records around the world, is very critical of India, incredibly critical. And so I think there's a fine balancing act that's happening amongst some governments. They recognize that India is obviously a huge market for trade, and there is some strategic considerations as seeing India as a bulwark of sorts against China, but a lot of that is starting to show cracks.
So let's talk a bit about the Sikh community in Canada. So you talked about how this allegation from the Canadian government isn't surprising and that the community suspected that this was the case. So beyond the warnings that people close to Nijjar say he received, why is that? Why was it not surprising for people here?
India has a long history of maligning and demonizing the Sikh Canadian community, and we don't have to go that far back to think of examples. During Trudeau's first trip to India, the Sikh community was on the receiving end of a blunt hammer from the Indian state. We know of various reports of how Indian intelligence operates out of consulates to spy on and conduct espionage against the Sikh community. We know that our institutions have attracted Indian intelligence, have attracted Indian agents. There's agents that used to work in Canada that have put out books about their experience in Canada and how they're tasked with infiltrating gurdwaras and Sikh organizations. But I think they were pleasantly surprised and quite frankly impressed with how our government has responded and has stood shoulder to shoulder with the Sikh community, because for the longest time, the Sikh community has felt alone in fighting Indian interference in this country. And part of it, part of that has generated a resentment of sort in our community. Are we not Canadians? Do the issues we face not trigger any kind of importance from our government and our intelligence agency, from our media, from the general public? So to see the government come out as it has, and to see what has been generally a very unified response from opposition and community stakeholders, I think the Sikh community feels for the first time that they're not alone in this fight.
Yeah, people may have heard Jagmeet Singh's response to all of this. He also said that he found the allegations shocking but not surprising, and that he grew up hearing stories of reprisals against people who would dare to speak out on India's human rights record.
That you might be denied a visa, that if you went back to India, you could suffer violence, torture, and even death. I grew up hearing those stories. But to hear the Prime Minister of Canada corroborate a potential link between a murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil by a foreign government is something I could never have imagined.
It was actually really special watching Jagmeet Singh stand up and talk from like lived experience, like share like a personal testimony. Often we talk about representation in politics, and we kind of throw quotes around representation matters. We have to think deeper than that. And having Jagmeet Singh stand up and actually give a speech in Punjabi, speaking directly to the community in Parliament.
ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਆਪਾਂ ਅੱਜ ਸੁਣਿਆ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਛੋਟੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੂੰ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੀ ਹਕੂਮਤ
just adds a layer to what has been already an unprecedented moment.
But it's also worth mentioning, apparently Nijjar wasn't the only one who was approached by law enforcement and warned that their life was at risk, right? There was also a friend of Nijjar's, Moninder Singh, who said that he was approached by the RCMP.
Yeah, it's true.
Last year, 5 of us in the Sikh community were approached by National Security from the RCMP Inset Division. We were warned that our lives were at risk of imminent assassination. I have minor children at home. I was told I had to leave my home. I couldn't be around my kids or family for safety reasons.
Hardeep's, in our understanding, CSIS had a list of multiple names on it of folks facing threats, and that there was conversation of hits being out on against them. Hardeep Singh Nijjar wasn't just an outlier of sorts. There's other folks that India has targeted or was planning to target. And the reality is, for anyone advocating on Sikh issues, you're always told to kind of watch your back. And that includes myself. Now I haven't received any messages from CSIS or what have you of being under an imminent threat of any sorts. But any advocate that kind of speaks on Sikh issues knows that the Indian government is watching them, knows that you're probably not going to be able to travel to India. Your visa is probably going to be denied, and even if you did go, probably not the smartest idea, because they have a history of arbitrarily picking up and arresting individuals.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly mention before we move on, there were others outside of Canada around the same time that Hardeep Singh Nijjar was killed too. Avtar Singh Kanda in the UK and Paramjit Singh Panjwar in Pakistan.
Again, the Sikh community believes they were also assassinated by the Indian state, and this kind of goes back to the point I made earlier about our Five Eye allies. So the ramifications of what's happening in Canada, it's not just a Canada-India issue. It really is a global issue. And I think what worries India right now is how many layers are going to be peeled and how wide is the collateral going to be.
Okay, Jaskaran, thank you so much for walking us through this and for all your insight. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow.